Tonight, Joshua Meyrowitz continues his discussion of the social impact of television. Joshua Meyrowitz is an associate professor of communications at the University of New Hampshire and author of the recently published book, No Sense of Place. He is interviewed by Robert Fulford in Washington.
In your book, No Sense of Place, you deal in some detail with the fact that television strips away the boundaries between spheres of life, the boundaries that limit discourse to within this area of life or that area of life. How does that work? How does television actually do that? After all, isn't it just a little screen we look at and see a few amusing things on?
Well, I don't think so, because I, for example, live in a small town in New Hampshire, but when I want to know what's going on in my world, I don't go down to the local hardware store anymore and sit around with the boys and find out what's going on in the town. I don't really live in that town quite in the same way I used to. Instead, I go into my home, isolated in a sense, in my living room, and look at the blurry TV image to see what's going on, to see what people are talking about. And I look to a larger set of experiences to find my place now in the world. I've, in the last few years, seen babies starving in Ethiopia. I've seen racial riots in South Africa. I've witnessed hostage crises from around the world. And I have a sense that these are the things that are happening. And in that sense, I'm now, while I'm plugged into a larger informational experience, I'm also cut off now from the things that are outside my window. I look out my window and there are trees and there are houses and there are people, but I don't know that much about them anymore. I'm not as tied in to them anymore. I'm tied more into a vague and broad experience through television and other electronic media.
I think you mentioned in your writing that there was a fire in your town in New Hampshire, right, and you never found out if anyone was hurt, or you heard there was a fire, but right, you never found out about it because it wasn't big enough to be on TV.
Right, well, I think we all had experiences such as this. This was during the hostage crisis in Lebanon, the TWA plane that was hijacked, and that's what we were all talking about. And you found that unless you were a close friend or a neighbor of the people whose house was burned down, you just vaguely heard that a house had been burned down. This wasn't the big news that people even in this town were talking about. Somehow the big news was this other set of events. So in that sense, we no longer really live in towns the way our grandparents did, and it doesn't set the boundaries of our experience.
I was reading about the Canadian playwright John Gray, who came from a very small town in the eastern part of Canada, in the Maritimes, and he said nowadays the people there, among other things, on their cable, they get a Detroit television station. And this small town, which is very peaceful and quiet, they're really worried about the crime rate. I mean, it's something they talk about, is the crime rate, because of course the Detroit local television is full of the crime rate.
Right. It's hard to ignore the things that you see on television. You tend to find them incorporated into your experience. It's hard not to think about them and talk about them.
Does this mean that you lose touch with your neighbors, that you cease to care what happens down the street?
Well, I think that we continue to feel that we care and we worry about people, but I think the close-knit, lifelong ties to people in given places has been blurred by this larger sense of affiliation. There's a limit to how many things we can do, to how much money we can give, to how many causes we can worry about. And I think you'd find that in the last year, more people have given money to eliminate famine in Ethiopia than they have given donated items to rummage sales or to people who are poor in their own cities and their own towns. And somehow we get pulled out of our place-bound experiences by television and electronic media.
From a certain perspective, say the perspective of 1920, looking at this, imagining a future in which North Americans and Western Europeans would be able to understand, at least to some extent, what's going on in different parts of the world, see statesmen of every kind on television, and see some kind of reality out there in India or China, Russia. Wouldn't you say that sounds like the most wonderful thing in the world, looking at from 1920? I mean, if you lived in that New Hampshire town, and
Right.
we'll say, for the sake of argument, you were an intellectual living in that small New Hampshire town, you read a lot more than other people, but you perceived that all your friends or your acquaintances were so place-bound. They were so limited by their sense of what's going on down at the hardware store. They didn't know anything about the world. Even though the world might have exploded on them in the First World War, basically they didn't know anything about the world. And you look on them with a certain contempt, and you imagine if you could say, well, one day they'll be able to see the whole world. Wouldn't that sound wonderful?
I think it does sound wonderful in the abstract, because whenever we think of that type of change, we always think that we'll have what we have plus
Something else.
this new thing. We don't see that this completely restructures the environment. It's like having a child. You get married, you think, oh, wouldn't it be great to have a child? You think, well, we'll have our relationship as it is, and then we'll have this kid in addition. Anyone who's had a child knows that that's not quite the way it works, that the relationship with your spouse changes dramatically when you have a young child, and you get all kinds of deflections of that relationship into the child, and you don't see each other quite as much. You don't always sleep at the same time. You don't have that much time to speak to each other. And I think that's an analogy for the type of change that we're experiencing now. By opening up the world, we've lost some of our sense of attachment to the people we live in, not only in our communities, but also within our own homes.
In what way within our own homes? Because we see them all the time. They're with us.
Well, you have a strange thing. Many people, for example, have their family interaction over dinner with the television set on. And rather than interacting with each other and having an experience that's unique to that family that night, you find people not really talking to each other that much, shushing each other except during the commercials so they can watch the news or whatever, and having an experience that's very similar, broadly at least, to the experience of every other family in the country, and then going to work the next day and finding that people have seen the same shows and talked about the same shows. It's kind of a dilution of experience, of unique experience within the family. Also, the meaning of rooms in the house has been changed by television and other electronic media. It used to be, for example, that you could send a child to his or her room as a form of punishment. Why was that punishment? Because you were excommunicating them. You were cutting them off from the family interaction that was so precious and so unique. But now, if the child's room is equipped with a television, a stereo, a computer, and a telephone,
That's a very prosperous child, of course, a very affluent child.
or any one of those,
Yeah.
a $59 television set, or a $3 radio. Sending the child to his or her room is no longer excommunicating them. It's no longer cutting them off. They can still be plugged into environments that are outside. So you can be sitting in the same room now with your family, and you can be not really interacting, and you can divide your family into different rooms and yet be plugged into similar news and information and entertainment. It's a strange restructuring of our physical environment.
And a restructuring, as you say, of our affiliations. But what does that do to us emotionally? Do you have any idea of what is the effect on us in terms of our feelings about ourselves when we are in touch with the world in this still fairly new way?
I think the first wave of reaction was to a heightened sense of consciousness of many problems, things that used to occur, we sort of maybe knew that they were occurring, discrimination against blacks and abuse of certain types of people. But now we were exposed to it suddenly. And I think the first response, especially among the first television generation, was to be outraged and to be moved to social reform. But I think as we've had this now increased electronically heightened consciousness, we've become emotionally exhausted. There's so many things for us to worry about and to be concerned about that it's difficult to know who to care about and who to give our money to and who to give our time to. And I think that we've seen now a trend somewhat in the other direction where we find, therefore, people are concerned now with number one, with themselves. And we find more that I have as much right as everybody else, and that I have to be concerned with myself. And I think we've moved now in two directions where we see concern with very broad global issues, such as nuclear disarmament or nuclear concerns. At the same time, concerns with very private, personal, egocentric demands. And I think that we're seeing, that's one of the reasons that we're seeing the most common form of household in the United States now is a single person household.
And why is that?
Because people are split off now from their ties, the traditional ties with family and community, and because living alone no longer quite means living alone in a psychological sense. You're physically alone, but you have a sense of being tied in to the larger society. You can decide who you want to watch, who you want to call, who you want to see, when you want to see them. We've gained a tremendous control over the number and type of interactions that we have, but unfortunately many of those interactions are vicarious and indirect.
I think a great deal of your approach, not your specific thinking, but a great deal of your approach to communications as an environment crucial to our mind, it comes from Harold Innis, the Canadian scholar, Canadian political economist, and also from Marshall McLuhan. Is that right?
Yes. These Canadian thinkers have an approach to the study of media that I think is much more meaningful than many of the experiments or statistical counting of violent acts on television. I think perhaps because they were Canadian, they were somewhat removed from the American mass media scene and were not as much concerned with running it or administrating it, but could see some of the massive structural changes. They were not that good at articulating exactly what was happening or why, and in a sense I try to fill in that gap, to take their general perspective, but give us a more clear way of understanding the mechanism of the process through which these types of changes lead to changes in the way that we interact, and the changes between children, adults, men and women, and authorities and average citizens.
I guess Harold Innis was really a man of the pre-television era. He died around 1950.
Right.
So for him, this most gripping, riveting confirmation of his theories came too late. But his theory really was that our society develops itself, creates itself in response to the media environment, and whether the medium involved is papyrus or radio.
Right. And he saw that every medium had a kind of a bias
Towards something.
Towards something, that it tended to either last a long time or to be able to travel quickly across distance, and that tended to structure the societies. Those societies that had very stable stone carvings tended to maintain a very traditional form of government, but you can't send a stone carving across great empires, and so they didn't tend to control a lot of space. And what I see as the common thread between Innis and my work is looking at something about the structure of the medium itself. How does something about its form, about the way we perceive it, about the way we encode or decode its messages, how does that affect us in ways that may be beyond the specific message that we put in it? Innis, for example, pointed out that you could take the Bible and handwrite it by the church's scribes and have very tight control of the Catholic Church over the Bible and therefore over salvation. But then you get the printing press, and suddenly you can give many copies to people who couldn't afford the handwritten scrolls, and suddenly you find a decrease in the authority of the Catholic Church,
and Protestantism
growing and really riding the wave of literacy. So there you have the same exact message, the Bible, and yet it has completely different effects in different media. And that's that type of analysis is what I try to do with our shift from the printing press and a literate culture and the extension of literacy now to an electronic communication environment where we rely so heavily now on television, radio, telephones, and computers.
Marshall McLuhan once said in introducing one of Harold Innis's books, he once said that my own work is merely a footnote to the work of H.A. Innis. But McLuhan's footnote became much more famous than the original body of the work, of course.
Yeah.
What do you think was the effect of McLuhan on this kind of argument? He made arguments very similar to the ones you make.
Right. I think that McLuhan argued about the effects of television using a kind of television style, using slogans and using puns and aphorisms that called people's attention to that something was happening here. But he never really explained exactly how it happened. He talked about people having a new sensory balance, though I'm not sure how people with one sensory balance behave differently from people with other sensory balances. What I've tried to do is to take McLuhan's general perspective that he said the medium is the message, by which he meant that the medium that you use, when you use and adapt a new medium, it tends to have a massive structural change in the society regardless of the specific messages that you communicate. And I tried to talk about that in terms of some of the understanding that we've gained in recent years about why people behave the way they do with certain people in different places, And I draw this from actually another person who's born Canadian, Irving Goffman, and then did most of his work in the United States, the sociologist, who never looked at media at all, but described how we behave differently in different places, how we have onstage roles, and we go backstage to rehearse and to relax, where parents discuss on stage certain things with their children, but then go backstage to say, what do we do and how do we deal with this? So what I try to look at is to adapt that model of Goffman's, to look at what happens when we move the dividing line between our on-stage and backstage settings. What happens when we move it so that what used to be backstage is now exposed to the audience? When audiences see their parents or their leaders or people of the other sex rehearsing for them, what does that do to our ability to play out the on-stage role? And I look at how different media either increase or decrease our ability to keep secrets from other people, to have backstages, and therefore change the style of our on-stage interactions with each other. And what I found is that if you look through history, you find that the more people can get away from each other, the more men and women can have separate spheres, the more children and adults can be separated from each other, the more authorities and average citizens can somehow be separated into different places or different sets of information through different reading levels or different literatures, the more you find that children behave very differently from adults, that men and women play very different roles for each other, and the more that authorities act very different from average citizens, and the more that you throw people together, either, for example, in hunting and gathering societies where people just can't get away from each other.
You said that we are moving from a print culture to an electronic culture, and certainly this was McLuhan's central message to the world. And first of all, in the 1950s, when he alarmed a great many people by saying the book is dead, he would say things like that, and then he'd later say, "Oh, I didn't say quite that," and so on. And of course, he used a book
to convey that message.
He used books himself to convey the message that books were dying or were irrelevant. Now,
which, by the way, I never saw any paradox in that, and that you could hear a clergyman lecture from the pulpit that the church is declining in importance, and it wouldn't be considered paradoxical that he was speaking from a pulpit. But somehow McLuhan was attacked for writing in books that there was a decrease in the significance of books.
Well, the implication of the attack was surely that books are what matter, and McLuhan had chosen books to make his message evident to scholars everywhere, and the implication was that books matter now, and they'll matter 1,000 years from now, and nothing else matters. Nothing else matters so much. What about that, though? In what sense are we moving from a print to an electronic culture? I mean, if you go to school now, first thing they do is try and teach you how to read, and if you go right through to your PhD level, you're going to be to get a PhD today.
You have to learn how to read.
You have to write what is the equivalent of a book.
Right.
As you did when you got your doctorate. You're a person of the television age, and yet your life is in books. Your life is in working over pieces of paper and reading other pieces of paper with printing on them.
Right. I think the issue of the school is a very good example. I don't think that we're really moving from a print culture to an electronic culture. I think that McLuhan, in his style, always overstated things, and I think that what we mean when we say we're moving from a print to an electronic culture is not that the book is dead, but that we're changing the priorities of things. For example, when we say we move from an agricultural society to industrial society, we don't mean that we stop eating or growing food. We mean that there's a shifting emphasis on what we do. And it's only in that sense that we're moving from print to an electronic culture. In fact, we're really moving from an oral writing print culture to now an oral writing print electronic culture. And we see an adjustment in all the other forms to adjust to the new kid on the block. Most of the books that are sold today have been televisionized in some way. They have more pictures, they have larger type. Those are the books that sell often.
Or they've been discussed on television, such as your book right now.
Right, exactly. Also, in the school system, the structure of the school system, I think, is in a lot of trouble, more than the lessons that it wants to teach. I think that it's very important for people to learn how to read, because reading gives you access to a way of thinking, a step-by-step linear analysis that is impossible in any other form. You can't do it in oral interaction because you can't remember all the things you'd want to be able to write down in a long-developed theory. And you can't do it on television because television doesn't seem to be able to deal very well with complex ideas. This show is a rare exception. And I think that the school system, as it developed, developed to match the spread of literacy. It used to be in oral cultures that school systems, before the spread of the printing press, had people of all different ages together, and it was suspicious for a teacher to have to rely on notes. To know meant to know by heart. But with the spread of literacy, the school adapted to literacy. It started to assume that if you didn't know how to read, you didn't know very much, and that you could be told different things based on different levels of access to reading.
You were phased in towards adulthood.
Exactly. Yeah. So you could be told in an early book that all the leaders of the country are great and they never tell lies, and then you're slowly told that George Washington was a terrible general and that there was a lot of graft in the administration of various presidents, and you're let in on secrets as you go up the age-graded structure. Television doesn't support the old lesson plans anymore. Television gives out its information in no particular order or sequence.
They just spread it all before you.
Right, and there you have this smorgasbord. It's full of misperceptions. It needs analysis. It needs children to decipher and interpret what they have there. But you can no longer assume, as many teachers I've spoken to, that children can't or should not know about certain things. They know about the hostage crises. They know about war. They know about death. They know about the fact that their parents are on occasion alcoholics or abuse each other or their children. They know about all these flaws, and I think that the school system has to adapt to this. And it's in that sense, I think, that we're moving from a print culture to an electronic culture.
You have a school system which is colored by television's concerns.
Right, and you see this in every other institution. The family is now affected by the fact that the walls of the house, of the home, are now so porous. They have so many gaps and holes where the family members' access and accessibility to other people is so great that the family interaction is different. And you can't simply say, well, let's ignore that. Also in politics, for most of the history of the United States and Canada, most of the people in the country never saw their leaders. But it's unimaginable today for someone to run for the highest office without appearing frequently on television. It's in that sense that we've moved to an electronic culture where it seems to dominate many of our activities. It seems to be at the forefront in terms of breaking through barriers, of lifting veils of secrecy. And we're seeing adjustments and repercussions in every other aspect of our lives.
You've devoted a large part of your career so far to what are sometimes called media studies, or certainly the analysis of television and other electronic media. Aside from the fact that it's better that we understand more of the world than less of the world, aside from that fact, what is the point of media study? That is to say, to go back to McLuhan for a moment, he would actually lecture occasionally to advertising men who found him baffling but intriguing.
But willing to pay him.
They were willing to pay him to lecture. And they thought that if they listened to him, they would know something that he knew, and they would end up being much wiser advertising men. Mm-hmm. I don't think that worked at all.
Right.
And I don't really think McLuhan, in his most serious moments, would have wanted it to work. Mm-hmm. But where do your studies and those of other people, such as yourself, lead us? Do you hope television executives will read your books and do better, or educators, or what?
Well, I think the example of the school system we just discussed is one area there. I think that it points to shifting the focus to accepting some of the basic changes that we have without abdicating entirely to television. I don't in any way advocate that teachers, for example, bring television sets into the classroom in order to gain and keep students' attention. But I also don't think that it's very useful to say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could eliminate television and have the school system the way it was, and let's do whatever we have to do to try to maintain something as close to that as possible. If we can't keep the kids in the rooms, let's bring in guards. If the children want to talk about things that we don't want them to talk about, let's throw them out and send them to the principal's office. Let's just refuse let's stonewall them and not talk to them about it. I think that it points to a broader and more historical way of looking at the way that the adaptation and widespread use of media tends to change who knows what about whom, and therefore how other institutions, especially those that deal with giving out information, such as the school system, will have to change in some way. I also think that it gives people a more realistic sense of what's going on. For example, in the feminist movement and its relationship with television. I think that the feminists tend to be so concerned with the content of television that they haven't really seen what television seems to be doing in terms of breaking down the differences between male and female experience. And I think it gives us a way of focusing our energies on those issues that are important and not looking at those things that are not long-lasting effects. For example, the printing press, what we discussed earlier, was used primarily at first to spread religion. And so people looking at the content of early books would say, well, the printing press is a force for the increasing religiosity. But if you looked over the time that reading and literacy spread, you'd see that exactly the opposite was the case. That reading and literacy, because they focus on independent thinking, on questioning, on analysis and logical, long-term and connected arguments, they actually were a force against religiosity, and it led to the secularization of society and the growth of science and the scientific revolution. So I think that it gives us some more perspective on how to deal with television and other media in a longer term way, to look at what television as a form of communicating, because of its accessibility to people regardless of their levels of reading ability, and because of regardless of where they are physically within the environment. It gives us some sense of what's going on in the culture. It also gives us more perspective on where we're coming from, on what the effects of literacy were. Many of us grew up so deeply embedded in the literate culture that we don't even see it as a medium of communication. And it's hard for us to imagine, for example, that Socrates, who was a great scholar of an oral culture, thought that writing was a terrible invention that would destroy people's memories. I'm sure the SAT scores in writing, in memory, were going way down in Socrates' day, if there were such exams, and that was leading people to be very, very frightened about what was going on. And I think it gives us some way to take a breath and to see what's happening in larger structural ways in our relationships with each other, in our families, in the workplace, in politics, and in education.
Joshua Meyrowitz is an associate professor of communications at the University of New Hampshire and author of the recently published book, No Sense of Place. He was interviewed by Robert Fulford in Washington. I'm Suzanne Grew Ellis. Good night.